Ethan Wallace sat in the vast living room of his Manhattan penthouse, the city glittering far below like a galaxy of lights. The glass walls framed the skyline in perfection, a view that few could afford and even fewer could enjoy with such indifference. To most, this room-polished marble floors, Italian furniture, an art collection worth millions would have symbolized the pinnacle of success. To Ethan, it was simply Tuesday night. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass and watched the lights blink in the distance, detached, as though the entire city were part of a simulation he controlled. At 42, Ethan Wallace had everything that defined victory in his world. He was the founder and CEO of Wallace Capital, a financial empire that stretched across continents. His face graced magazine covers, his words moved markets, and his name commanded respect. But behind that immaculate image lived a man who measured worth not in human connection, but in acquisition. Success had become both his armor and his prison. He rarely questioned it, because questioning meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was something Ethan had long ago buried beneath layers of arrogance. That evening, the penthouse buzzed with the hum of conversation and the clinking of expensive glassware. Ethan was hosting one of his renowned gatherings, half social, half strategic, where Manhattan's most influential figures mingled under the warm glow of chandeliers. Waiters in black suits moved silently through the room with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Laughter drifted through the air, light but hollow, as conversations swirled around profits, art auctions, and private islands. Ethan moved through the crowd like a conductor among instruments he had long mastered. Compliments followed him, as natural and rehearsed as applause after a speech. He responded with polite smiles and sharp wit, every word calculated. No one in that room intimidated him. They were all players in the same game, and Ethan was its reigning champion. Near the marble bar stood Daniel Pierce, an old friend or as close as anyone could come to that title in Ethan's world. Daniel had built his fortune in venture capital and wore success with the same ease as his tailored suit. He watched Ethan approach with a knowing grin and raised his glass. "Still at the top of the food chain, I see," Daniel said, his voice carrying a mix of admiration and challenge. Ethan smirked. "Would you expect anything less?" "Not really," Daniel replied, sipping his wine. "But tell me something, Ethan. Don't you ever get tired of it? The same faces, the same conversations, the same, what do you call it, performance?" "Tired?" Ethan echoed, feigning amusement. "Why would I change something that works?" Daniel chuckled, setting his glass down. "Because it's predictable. You've built an empire, but you've also built walls around yourself so high that nothing ever surprises you anymore." Ethan tilted his head, intrigued despite himself. "You're suggesting I need a surprise?" "I'm suggesting you need a challenge," Daniel said, leaning in slightly, his tone taking on a conspiratorial edge. "Something you can't control, something or someone you can't buy your way through." Ethan laughed, sharp and confident. "There's no such thing." "Oh, I think there is," Daniel said, straightening with a glint in his eye. "Tell you what, I'll make you a bet." The word hung between them, sparking Ethan's interest instantly. He had always been competitive to the bone. Every achievement in his life had been a wager he refused to lose. "I'm listening," he said, voice measured. Daniel gestured toward the crowd. "We both know your type, young, polished, picture perfect. Women who fit neatly into this little universe of yours. But what if you stepped outside it? Married someone completely opposite?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, his tone dry. "Define opposite." "Someone who doesn't belong to this world of champagne and headlines," Daniel replied. "Not a model, not a socialite. Someone real. Someone who's not conventionally beautiful by your standards, who doesn't care about your money. You marry her, live with her for 6 months, no loopholes, no manipulation, and if you succeed, I'll invest $50 million into Wallace Capital. No strings attached." Ethan's laughter rang out, smooth and self-assured. "You want me to play house with a stranger for half a year? And what exactly constitutes success?" Daniel's grin widened. "You make it work. You don't quit, don't cheat, don't walk away. 6 months. You do that, you win." If not, well, let's just say your reputation as the man who always wins might take a bit of a hit. Ethan studied him, the faintest smirk curling his lips. You really think I'd lose? I think, Daniel said, lifting his glass again, that for once you'd be stepping into a game you don't know how to play. Ethan's eyes gleamed with amusement and pride. The idea was absurd, but that was precisely what made it irresistible. For him, the impossible was just another business deal waiting to be conquered. You're on, he said, shaking Daniel's hand. The crowd continued to laugh and chatter around them, oblivious to the bet that had just been sealed, a wager that would unravel Ethan's world more completely than any hostile takeover ever could. When the last guest had left and silence reclaimed the penthouse, Ethan sat by the window, looking down at the city once more. A smirk played at his lips. Marry someone outside his world? Fine. It would be an experiment, a game. He had no doubt he'd emerge victorious. He always did. The following morning, he summoned his assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Natalie. I need you to find someone, he said. A woman, someone different. Natalie raised an eyebrow. Different how? Not from our usual circles, he said. No socialites, no influencers, no one who's ever been on page 6. Someone grounded, real. Natalie gave him a cautious look but didn't question him. She was used to Ethan's eccentric whims. Within days, she returned with a confidential list of candidates, women who ran small businesses, taught in schools, volunteered in community centers. Ethan skimmed through their profiles like a man scanning resumes. He felt no connection to any of them until one photo stopped him cold. Clara Brooks. She wasn't like the women he was used to. No sharp cheekbones, no designer wardrobe, no polished facade. She was curvy, full-figured, with warm blue eyes and a soft smile that seemed to hold something disarmingly genuine. Her file described her as the founder of a small nonprofit organization in Brooklyn called Second Step, which helped single parents rebuild their lives. 35 years old, single, with a background in social work. Ordinary on paper, extraordinary in how unapologetically real she seemed. She'll do, Ethan said. Natalie hesitated. She's not from your world, sir. Exactly. He arranged a meeting under the pretense of discussing a potential corporate partnership. When Clara arrived at his office, she was everything her profile had suggested and more. She wore a navy blue blouse and a modest skirt, her brown hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wasn't intimidated by the opulent office or by Ethan's cool demeanor. If anything, she seemed quietly unimpressed, which intrigued him. Mr. Wallace, she said, extending her hand with polite firmness. Thank you for meeting with me. I didn't expect a hedge fund CEO to take an interest in a small nonprofit like ours. Ethan smiled his practiced smile. I believe in supporting meaningful causes, Ms. Brooks. Your work caught my attention. She tilted her head, assessing him. Meaningful causes or good PR? He chuckled softly. Can't they be the same thing? Her lips curved faintly, though not in amusement. Not usually. As she spoke about her organization's its mission, its constant struggle for funding, the lives it touched. Ethan listened, pretending to care while mentally calculating his next move. When the moment felt right, he leaned forward. Clara, I have a proposal for you. She looked up, wary but curious. What kind of proposal? A mutually beneficial arrangement, he said smoothly. You'll receive the funding your organization needs. In return, you'll help me reshape my image. Clara frowned. How exactly? Ethan met her gaze, his voice calm and deliberate. Marry me. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the city outside. Clara blinked, unsure if she'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? Marry me, he repeated. 6 months. You'll have complete control over your work, your independence, everything. I'll provide financial support for Second Step enough to secure it for years. In return, we maintain a public image of marriage. No tricks, no catch. Clara stared at him, disbelief etched across her face. That's not a proposal. That's absurd. Ethan's expression didn't waver. It's business. Her instinct was to walk out right then, but something in his tone, perhaps the quiet arrogance, the assumption that she'd eventually say yes, made her pause. She thought of her staff, of the families depending on her, of the endless rejection letters from donors who didn't care. This could change everything for them. "I need time to think," she said, finally standing. "Of course," Ethan said, offering a polite nod. But as she left, he allowed himself a small, victorious smile. In his experience, everyone had a price. It was only a matter of finding what they valued most. That night, as he poured another drink and watched the city lights dance across the skyline, Ethan felt the familiar thrill of competition stir within him. This was a game like no other, a chance to prove once again that nothing was beyond his control. But what he didn't yet know was that the woman he'd chosen would soon become the one person he couldn't outsmart, outmaneuver, or outlast. The bet had begun, and the first move was his. The morning after his meeting with Clara, Ethan sat at his desk, staring out over the skyline. He had not been able to shake the sound of her voice, measured, skeptical, confident. It was not the voice of a woman who could be easily impressed. That in itself was intriguing. Most people bent toward him, softened when confronted with his money or reputation. Clara Brooks, it seemed, was made of sterner stuff. That resistance, he told himself, was what made her the perfect subject for the challenge he had accepted. He would win her agreement, fulfill the absurd conditions of Daniel's bet, and then, as always, come out on top. The next few days unfolded with the precision of a business negotiation. Ethan called his legal team to draft a prenuptial contract that left no detail unaccounted for. It was a cold, transactional document, the kind he trusted more than words. When he finally called Clara again, she sounded wary but calm. They met once more at his office, and she listened as he explained the terms with that same composed expression, arms folded as though she were protecting herself from the very air he breathed. "I've read your offer," she said when he finished, "and I think you're underestimating what you're asking for." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his confidence unshaken. "It's an arrangement. 6 months of your time, financial security for your organization, and privacy for you afterward. You'll be free to live your life as you please." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You make it sound like a business merger." "In a way it is," he replied. She exhaled slowly, the corner of her mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You really don't see marriage as anything more than a contract, do you?" Ethan hesitated for the briefest moment before saying, "Contracts work. They keep people honest. They keep people controlled," she corrected softly. Her words hung between them, more unsettling than he expected. Still, by the end of the meeting, Clara agreed on her own conditions. Her independence was non-negotiable. She would continue to run her nonprofit without interference. The money he contributed would go directly into programs, not salaries or image projects. And if she felt her values compromised, she would end the marriage, contract or not. Ethan accepted every term. The bet was all that mattered. The wedding was arranged swiftly and without ceremony. Ethan hired a discreet event planner to handle everything in less than 2 weeks. There were no lavish floral displays, no glossy magazine spreads, just a private ceremony at a downtown registry office, followed by a reception in one of his smaller penthouse salons. Clara wore a simple ivory dress she had bought herself. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and her makeup was barely there. She looked calm, almost detached, as though she had sealed away every emotion that might betray discomfort. Ethan, as always, wore control like a second skin. The officiant's voice echoed faintly against the glass walls as they exchanged vows neither of them truly believed. When Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, she looked down at it with an unreadable expression. For a fleeting instant, something flickered behind her eyes, perhaps regret, perhaps resolve. But then it was gone. They signed the papers, smiled for the cameras his assistant discreetly arranged, and it was done. The reception that followed was sparsely attended. Several of Ethan's colleagues, 2 distant relatives, and a scattering of public figures. Clara felt like a stranger among them. Conversations about market trends and investment portfolios floated around her like meaningless noise. When people addressed her, it was with polite curiosity, thinly veiled as admiration. "So how did you and Ethan meet?" one woman asked, eyes glimmering with speculation. Clara smiled faintly. "Through work." "How romantic," the woman said with a smirk, before turning back to her champagne. Ethan, meanwhile, thrived in the environment. He moved effortlessly from guest to guest, the perfect host. From a distance, Clara studied him, the ease, the charm, the way he seemed untouchable, and felt a strange pang she couldn't name. When his gaze finally met hers, he smiled as though this were all natural. She looked away. When the last guest had gone and the apartment was quiet again, Ethan turned to her. "You handled yourself well," he said. "Like a business partner, you mean?" she replied. He smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it." "I hope not," she said, walking toward the guest room without looking back. Her refusal to share his bed didn't surprise him, though it pricked his ego more than he cared to admit. It was, he told himself, irrelevant. This was about appearances, not affection. Yet as the days turned into weeks, her distance began to feel less like practicality and more like defiance. They lived together as strangers bound by paper. Ethan continued to dominate his empire from the top floor, surrounded by screens and reports. Clara spent her days in Brooklyn, at the modest community center she had built from nothing. Every morning she left early, refusing his offers of a car, choosing instead the subway that took her across a city he only ever saw from above. Every evening she returned late, often with tired eyes and a faint smell of coffee and chalk dust. Ethan began to notice her absence more than he expected. The penthouse, usually a symbol of power, started to feel strangely hollow. When she was home, she occupied the space quietly but completely, her presence grounding the sterile luxury in a way he couldn't define. He caught himself listening for the sound of her footsteps in the hall, the soft rustle of papers from her laptop at the kitchen counter. It irritated him that she had this effect, subtle, persistent, unsettling. One morning he decided to confront it. She was sitting at the breakfast table, scrolling through documents on her tablet, a steaming mug beside her. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm but alert. "You know," he said, pouring himself coffee, "if you spent less time buried in paperwork and more time attending some of my events, you might actually enjoy yourself." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Enjoy myself? At one of your charity galas where people pretend to care about causes they don't understand?" "They raise millions of dollars," he said, defensive. "For the organizers, maybe," she replied, setting her mug down. "For the people who actually need help, they're just photo opportunities." Her tone was factual, not cruel, but it stung nonetheless. Ethan had built his life on the belief that influence could fix anything. Her bluntness stripped that illusion bare. He tried again, masking his irritation with charm. "There's an event tonight, a dinner for one of our new initiatives. It would mean a lot if you joined me." She looked at him steadily. "And by mean a lot, you mean it would look good for your image?" "Call it what you want," he said, forcing a smile. "It's still a good opportunity for you to network." "I'm not interested in networking with people who think charity is a form of performance art," she said. "But thank you." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. That night he went alone. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished smiles. Ethan drifted from conversation to conversation, but his mind wasn't in the room. Every laugh felt forced, every toast hollow. When someone asked about his new wife, he gave a polite answer and moved on. But he couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at him that morning. Steady, unimpressed, real. Later, when he returned to the empty penthouse, her absence felt louder than the silence. The next day, he decided to take a different approach. If she wouldn't come into his world, he would step into hers. He showed up at her office unannounced, dressed in his usual suit, his driver waiting outside. The building was a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn, its walls covered with murals painted by local kids. Inside, it was a whirlwind of activity volunteers sorting donations, a small classroom filled with children reading aloud, the faint hum of laughter mixed with exhaustion. Clara looked up from her desk, surprise flashing across her face. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see your work," he said simply. She crossed her arms. "Why? Trying to prove something?" "No," he said, though the truth was not so clear. "I just wanted to understand what you do." For a long moment she studied him, searching his expression for mockery. Finding none, she sighed and handed him a clipboard. "If you're serious, start by helping. We're sorting supplies for the pantry." He stared at the list, momentarily uncertain, but followed her lead. The work was monotonous, lifting boxes, labeling cans, filling bags for families in need. But he did it without complaint. At first, the volunteers watched him with suspicion, whispering behind his back. But as the hours passed, they saw that he was trying. He listened when they spoke, asked questions about the community, and didn't pretend to know more than he did. By the end of the day, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, his tie gone, his immaculate composure replaced by sweat and fatigue. When the last box was stacked and the lights dimmed, Clara approached him. Her face was tired but softened by something almost like approval. "Not bad," she said. He managed a small smile. "I can follow instructions." "That's new for you, isn't it?" He laughed, and for once the sound wasn't hollow. That evening, they rode back to Manhattan in silence. The car's windows reflected the city's glow, but Ethan wasn't looking at it. His thoughts were elsewhere, on the families he'd seen, the weary gratitude in their faces, and the quiet authority with which Clara had moved among them. It unsettled him, the realization that his power meant nothing in that world. When they reached the penthouse, she turned to him before stepping out. "Don't make a habit of showing up just to make yourself feel better. If you want to help, do it because you care, not because you're curious." He nodded, her words striking deeper than she knew. That night, as he sat alone by the window, the skyline no longer gleamed with its usual satisfaction. The reflections of glass and steel felt cold, almost accusatory. For the first time, he wondered if the world he'd built was not a triumph, but a cage, and if the woman sleeping in his guest room was the only person he'd ever met who could show him the way out. He didn't know it yet, but that day had marked the quiet beginning of his transformation. The bet, once a game, was starting to lose its meaning, replaced by something far more dangerous and profound. The slow, painful awakening of a conscience. The next morning he woke earlier than usual, not to trade stocks or negotiate contracts, but to watch the sunrise over the city. It had been years since he'd noticed its color. The morning after Ethan's visit to Clara's community center dawned gray and wet. Rain streaked the windows of the penthouse, softening the skyline into blurred outlines. Ethan stood by the window for a long time, his reflection faintly superimposed on the city below, and realized that the view which had once represented his triumph now felt strangely hollow. He had always thought of New York as a machine he could manipulate, its rhythm predictable, its people interchangeable. But yesterday had shown him something different. For the first time, he had seen a part of the city that did not revolve around money. He had seen struggle, and in the faces of the people who had welcomed Clara, he had seen resilience untouched by cynicism. It had unsettled him more deeply than he wanted to admit. He had spent most of his adult life believing that control was the essence of strength. He had built empires by imposing order, by forcing chaos into submission. But in that small center, surrounded by peeling paint and the smell of coffee, he had felt powerless and strangely alive. Clara had moved through that space with confidence born of purpose, not ambition. Her authority had come from compassion, not dominance. Ethan envied her for that. He poured himself coffee and stood watching the rain until he heard her soft footsteps behind him. She was dressed for work. Dark jeans, a simple sweater, her hair tied back loosely. She greeted him with a polite nod, as if they were colleagues sharing a brief morning meeting. "Good morning," he said, attempting ease. "Morning," she replied, moving to the counter to fill a travel mug. He hesitated. "About yesterday." She turned before he could continue, her tone neutral. "If you're going to thank me, don't. You didn't do it for me." Ethan smiled faintly, not from amusement but resignation. "You really don't let anyone off easy, do you?" "Not when they've spent their whole life getting by on charm," she said, and for a moment he almost laughed. There was no malice in her voice, only truth, and it disarmed him more than anger could have. When she left for the day, he stayed in the kitchen long after the elevator doors closed. The silence that followed her departure was not peaceful, it was the silence of absence. He tried to focus on work, but his concentration faltered. Numbers on the screen blurred. Deals he once found thrilling now seemed mechanical. Around noon, he found himself scrolling through the website of Second Step. There were photos of the families the organization had helped. A young mother holding her child outside a newly renovated apartment. A teenage boy smiling with his certificate from a job training program. A group of volunteers repainting a shelter. The faces were ordinary, imperfect, alive. For the first time, he understood what real impact looked like. That afternoon, he called Natalie into his office. "I want to set up a proper foundation," he said. "Not just another tax shelter, something that actually funds programs like Clara's." His assistant blinked, caught off guard. "A humanitarian foundation, sir?" "Yes. Start drawing up a plan. I'll review the proposals myself." She nodded, hiding her surprise. When she left, Ethan leaned back in his chair, wondering what Clara would say if she knew. He realized he wanted her approval more than he wanted Daniel's respect or the satisfaction of winning the bet. That thought startled him. The bet, he had almost forgotten it. He told himself it didn't matter. What mattered now was proving that he could make something good of his choices, even if those choices had started from selfishness. Over the next few weeks, he began visiting the community center regularly. At first, Clara treated him like any other volunteer. She gave him tasks and expected him to complete them without fanfare. He unpacked boxes, helped paint a wall, carried supplies. He was clumsy, out of place, but he kept showing up. Slowly, the volunteers stopped watching him with suspicion. They began to greet him with nods, sometimes even smiles. Clara observed him quietly, her skepticism intact but softening. She saw that he no longer treated the work as performance. He listened when people spoke to him. He asked questions about their lives, not out of politeness, but genuine interest. Once she caught him sitting on the floor, reading a picture book to a group of children while waiting for their parents to finish a meeting. The sight caught her off guard, tugging at something in her chest she didn't want to name. One afternoon, as they sorted donations together, she said, "You've been coming here a lot lately. Should I start putting you on the volunteer schedule?" He looked up from the clipboard, smiling. "Wouldn't that ruin my reputation?" "It might save it," she said, and he laughed. The laughter faded into a comfortable quiet. There was something between them now, an unspoken acknowledgement of change. Ethan could feel it every time their eyes met, in the small moments when words weren't necessary. But the world he had built did not let go easily. His board of directors began to question his sudden interest in philanthropy. "Investors don't like uncertainty," one of them warned. "You're spending too much time on social causes. It's not our image." Ethan dismissed the concern, though it lingered in his mind. For the first time, he wasn't motivated by image. He wanted substance, something that couldn't be measured in profit. The strain between his old life and the new one deepened. Clara noticed it too. She saw how tired he looked some mornings, the tension that followed him like a shadow. But she didn't press. She knew that change, real change, came with discomfort. Then came the evening that tested both of them. The community center was hosting its first major fundraiser, a modest event meant to draw local donors. Clara had planned it for weeks, coordinating every detail. When Ethan offered to help, she reluctantly agreed. The night of the event, the center was transformed. Tables were covered with simple white cloths, local musicians played softly in one corner, and handmade decorations from the children adorned the walls. The guests were a mix of small business owners, teachers, and neighborhood residence people who knew Clara not as a symbol, but as a neighbor. Ethan moved through the crowd, feeling oddly nervous. These weren't his people. There were no tailored suits or polished smiles, no rehearsed politeness. But as the evening unfolded, he found himself enjoying it. Conversations were honest, laughter unguarded. He saw Clara across the room, animated and radiant, speaking passionately about the organization's goals. For a moment, watching her, he forgot everything else. The bet, the money, the facade. Later, when the last guest had gone and they were cleaning up, Clara looked at him and said quietly, "You did well tonight." He shrugged. "I just followed your lead." "You listened," she said. "That's more than most people do." He smiled, but inside something heavier stirred. He wanted to tell her what she meant to him, that she had changed how he saw the world, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he said, "You make it easy to believe in what you do." She gave him a small, genuine smile, the kind that reached her eyes. Belief is a good start, but it's not enough. As they locked up the center, the city's hum outside seemed softer than usual, as though the world itself had slowed to listen. The next day, Ethan was back in his office when Daniel called. His old friend's voice was light, mocking. "How's married life treating you? I saw a photo. Looks like you're enjoying the charity work." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "Why are you calling, Daniel?" "To check on my investment," Daniel said. 6 months, remember? You've got, what, 3 left? The reminder hit like a blow. He had buried the memory of that night, of the reckless pride that had driven him. Now it came rushing back, poisoning the quiet progress he had made. This isn't about the bet anymore, Ethan said. Of course it isn't for you, Daniel replied, but it started that way. Don't forget who you are. Ethan ended the call without replying. For a long time he sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the dark screen of his computer. Who was he? The man Daniel described, or the one Clara saw? That evening, when he returned to the penthouse, Clara was already home. She was sitting on the couch, sorting through a stack of donation forms. He stood there for a moment, watching her, torn between honesty and fear. She looked up, sensing his hesitation. Everything all right? She asked. Yes, he said quickly, then paused. No, I don't know. She waited, her eyes patient. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess the truth about how their marriage had begun, but the words refused to come. He couldn't bear the thought of losing what fragile trust he had built. Instead, he said softly, I'm trying, Clara. I really am. I know, she said, surprising him, but trying only matters if you stop running from who you used to be. Her words lingered long after she left the room. That night, as he lay awake, Ethan realized he was no longer afraid of losing the bet. He was afraid of losing her respect. Days turned into weeks, and his visits to the center became routine. Together they worked on new programs, met with local sponsors, and planned expansions. Slowly, something resembling partnership began to grow between them. It wasn't love yet, not in the way people wrote about, but it was understanding, and that was rarer. One afternoon, as they packed boxes for the food drive, Ethan glanced at Clara and said, You were right about the galas. They don't change anything. She looked up, curious. What made you realize that? The faces I saw here, he said. They're real. There's no applause, no cameras, just gratitude. She nodded. And responsibility. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. He smiled faintly. I think I'd rather not. The light outside was fading, the room awash in the soft gold of late afternoon. For the first time in his life, Ethan Wallace felt something close to peace, not the peace of victory, but of belonging. He didn't know how long it would last, but for now, it was enough. He didn't notice, as he left that evening, that Daniel's words still echoed faintly in his mind like a distant warning. The truth he had buried was still waiting, patient and inevitable, beneath everything he had begun to build. It was a cold afternoon when the past came for Ethan. The sky above Manhattan was a washed-out gray, and the wind carried the brittle taste of approaching winter. He had spent the morning at the community center, fixing a broken heater in one of the classrooms with the help of a volunteer named Miguel. It was the sort of work that would once have seemed beneath him, yet now it gave him a strange satisfaction. He had just finished cleaning the grease from his hands when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and felt an immediate chill at the sight of the name. Daniel Pierce. He almost ignored the call. For a moment, he even placed the phone back in his pocket. But the past has a way of demanding attention, and when it calls, it rarely waits patiently. He stepped outside, away from the noise of the center, and answered. Daniel, he said, his tone clipped. Ethan! Daniel's voice was bright, careless, the voice of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. You've been hard to reach lately. Busy with your new hobbies? Ethan closed his eyes. What do you want? Oh, nothing serious, Daniel replied. Just checking on an old friend, and maybe to see how our little wager is going. Ethan felt the words hit him like a slap. He had not thought about the bet in months, not really. It had become buried under the rhythm of new habits, new priorities, a new self he was only beginning to understand. Hearing it spoken aloud again brought back all the ugliness of its origin. There is no wager, Ethan said quietly. Daniel laughed. Oh, come on. Don't pretend you've gone soft. You were always a man of your word, Ethan. You said 6 months. I just wanted to know how much longer until you've proven your point. My point, Ethan said, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened, was never about her. Then what was it about? You falling in love with a charity worker? Daniel's laughter was sharp and cruel. Don't tell me the great Ethan Wallace actually grew a conscience. Ethan hung up without answering. For several minutes he stood there on the sidewalk, motionless, his breath visible in the cold air. Around him Brooklyn pulsed with life traffic, voices, children running past, but he felt completely still, as if the world had shifted under his feet. He realized with a sickening clarity that everything he had built with Clara, every fragile moment of connection, rested on a foundation of deceit. She didn't know. Not yet. He thought of hiding it, of letting the truth die quietly in the dark. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he couldn't. The lie was a rot that would eat through everything he had become. That evening, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing financial reports from the center. The city lights cast a soft reflection on the marble counter. She looked up when he entered. "You're home late," she said. "I stopped by the office," he replied, his voice low. "We need to talk." Something in his tone made her close her laptop. "All right?" Ethan stood for a moment, unsure where to begin. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation, but this was different. There were no words that could soften the truth. "When we first met," he began, "I wasn't looking for partnership or charity. I was looking for a way to win." She frowned slightly, waiting. "I made a bet," he continued, "with Daniel Pierce. He said I couldn't marry someone outside my world and make it work. He offered money if I did. $50 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara stared at him as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Then slowly her expression hardened. "You made a bet," she repeated. "About me." "Yes," he said, "but it stopped being that. I swear to you, Clara, it hasn't been about the bet for a long time." Her face went pale, then cold. "You used me. You used my work, my life, everything I stand for." "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to?" Her voice rose, sharp with disbelief. "You married me as a game, Ethan. You lied to my face, and now you expect me to believe you didn't mean to?" He took a step closer, desperate. "It started that way, yes, but it changed. You changed me." She pushed back her chair and stood. "Don't you dare put that on me." The tears in her eyes were unshed, held back by sheer will. "You talk about change as if it erases what you did. You don't get to decide when the damage stops mattering." "Clara." "No." Her voice broke, but her words did not falter. "I built my life on trust, my work, my people, my whole purpose. It's about believing in others. And you, of all people, turned that into a wager." He had no defense. Every justification dissolved beneath the weight of her words. She picked up her bag, her movements sharp and deliberate. "I can't stay here. Not with you." He reached out, but she stepped back. "Don't. Just don't." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft finality that felt louder than any shout. The apartment fell into silence. Ethan stood there for a long time, the echo of her footsteps fading down the hall. The city outside continued to pulse, indifferent to his ruin. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring out at the skyline that had once been his kingdom. The lights blurred and swam in his vision, distorted by exhaustion and something perilously close to grief. He realized that for the first time in his life, he had no plan, no strategy, no next move. The game was over, and he had lost something that no amount of money could replace. In the days that followed, Clara's absence was a presence of its own. Her coffee mug still sat by the sink. Her scarf hung by the door. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the hallway. Everywhere he looked, she was there. Not in form, but in memory. He tried to bury himself in work, but the numbers on his screen no longer spoke to him. The thrill of business had evaporated, leaving only emptiness. Even his colleagues noticed the change. Meetings that once crackled with his energy now drifted into silence. Investors called, wondering if something was wrong. For the first time, Ethan didn't care. One afternoon, he received a letter from the board of directors, urging him to refocus on the company's priorities. They were polite but firm. The philanthropic projects he had initiated were costing too much, diverting attention from core operations. He stared at the letter for a long time, then tore it in half. The sound was oddly satisfying. Instead of returning to his old ways, he doubled down on the changes Clara had inspired. He created new funds for social programs, redirected corporate profits toward community development, and restructured Wallace Capital into something that served more than shareholders. The press called it reckless. Analysts predicted disaster. Ethan ignored them all. At night when the city was quiet, he thought of Clara. He wondered where she was, if she was safe, if she had found peace, if she hated him as much as he deserved. He thought of calling her, of begging for forgiveness, but pride and guilt held him back. He knew words would mean nothing now. Only time and action could speak for him. Months passed. The world took notice of his transformation. Articles appeared describing the new Ethan Wallace, the businessman turned humanitarian. None of it mattered to him. The praise felt hollow, the redemption incomplete. Every good deed he did was shadowed by the thought that it was too late. Then one morning a letter arrived at his office. There was no return address, but he knew the handwriting instantly. His heart pounded as he unfolded the paper. "Ethan," it began, "I've seen what you've been doing. The funding, the programs, the work. I don't know if it's for the world or for yourself, but either way, it's making a difference. I can't forgive you yet. Maybe I never will, but I see the change and part of me hopes it's real. Take care of yourself. Clara." He read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper than the last. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, an acknowledgement that his efforts were seen. That night, for the first time in months, he slept. From that day forward, Ethan devoted himself entirely to the cause that had once been hers. He visited shelters and community centers across the city, often anonymously, offering resources without fanfare. He learned to listen more than he spoke. The empire he had once built for pride became a tool for something greater. And yet, beneath it all, the ache remained. Every time he saw a woman with kind eyes or heard laughter that reminded him of her, the wound reopened. But he did not run from it. The pain was proof of what he had learned, that love, real love, could not be bought, bargained, or bet upon. It had to be earned, one honest act at a time. He never expected to see her again, but deep down, a part of him still hoped. Winter gave way to a reluctant spring, the kind that arrived shyly, brushing against the edges of the city without quite daring to stay. For months, Ethan had lived in quiet penance, burying himself in work that no longer revolved around power or profit. The foundation he had built in Clara's honor had expanded, funding projects across the city, shelters were repaired, youth programs established, food banks replenished. The press still spoke of him occasionally, painting him as a man reborn, but Ethan paid no attention. Redemption, he had learned, was not something you announced. It was something you lived, quietly, until the world stopped doubting and you stopped needing to prove it. Each morning began the same way. He would wake before sunrise, take coffee on the balcony, and watch the city below. The skyline still glittered, but he no longer looked at it as a symbol of conquest. To him now, it was a promise, fragile, imperfect, but worth protecting. When the world began to stir, he went to work at the Foundation's office, a modest space on the Lower East Side, far removed from the marble towers he once called his kingdom. His staff had grown used to the change. Gone was the sharp-tongued executive who demanded perfection and delivered pressure. The man who now stood in their midst was quieter, gentler, more present. He asked questions, listened to answers, and never raised his voice. But there were still moments when old habits resurfaced, moments when the old Ethan threatened to break through. Whenever that happened, he would think of Clara and remember the weight of her gaze the night she walked away. That memory was both a wound and a compass, guiding him towards something he could never undo, but could still honor. Though the months had steadied him, the ache remained. Clara's absence was no longer a sharp pain, but a constant, low hum beneath everything he did. Her letter sat in his desk drawer, edges worn from being read too many times. He had not tried to contact her again. He knew that reaching out too soon would only seem self-serving. Still, he thought of her often, of her laugh, her strength, the way her hands had moved when she spoke about the people she served. In his quietest moments, he wondered if she thought of him too. It was a Friday afternoon when fate, or perhaps something kinder, decided to intervene. Ethan had just finished reviewing a grant proposal when his assistant knocked gently on the door. "There's someone here to see you, Mr. Wallace," she said. She says it's important. He looked up absently. Who is it? The assistant hesitated. She didn't say, but I think you'll want to see her. Ethan felt a flicker of unease. For a moment, he thought it might be another journalist, eager to dissect the story of his so-called redemption. But when the door opened and Clara stepped inside, the world seemed to tilt. She looked different, though he couldn't say exactly how. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, still composed, still purposeful, but with a kind of quiet exhaustion that hadn't been there before. Her hair was shorter now, curling just above her shoulders, and she wore a simple navy coat. She seemed both familiar and foreign, like a melody remembered from a dream. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan rose slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Clara, he said, her name emerging like a prayer. Hello, Ethan, she replied softly. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Please sit. She hesitated before taking the seat. The air between them felt dense with things unsaid. I wasn't sure you'd ever come, he said. I wasn't sure I would either, she admitted, but I needed to see for myself. He nodded, understanding without asking what she meant. You mean to see if the change is real? Yes, she said simply. He sat back, searching for the right words. I don't know what to tell you, except that I've tried to make things right. Not for you, not only for you, but because it was the only way I could live with myself. Clara's gaze moved to the papers scattered across his desk, the plans, the financial reports, the handwritten notes in the margins. You've done a lot, she said quietly. More than most people would. It doesn't undo what I did. No, she agreed, her voice even. It doesn't, but it means something. Her calm unnerved him more than anger ever had. He had prepared himself for confrontation, for the sting of accusation, but not for this, her quiet, measured grace. I read about the foundation, she continued, and the programs. You're funding the new center in Harlem. He nodded. It's yours in a way. I built it after your design. She blinked, startled. My design? I found the proposal in your old office, he explained. The one about community-based education and job training. You never got the funding for it. A small smile touched her lips. I remember that project. We shelved it years ago. Well, Ethan said softly, it's happening now. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Outside, the sounds of the city filtered through the window, the distant honk of a taxi, the rhythm of footsteps on the pavement, life continuing as it always did. Why did you really do all this? Clara asked finally. Was it guilt? Ethan thought for a long time before answering. At first, yes. Guilt, shame, self-loathing, you can name it. But after a while, it stopped being about me. It became about them, about the people I ignored for most of my life. I can't fix what I did to you, Clara, but I can make sure no one else suffers because of my arrogance. She studied him, her expression unreadable. You sound like a different person. Maybe I am, or maybe I'm just finally the man I was supposed to be before I lost myself. Clara leaned back, her eyes distant. It's strange, she said. When you told me the truth, I hated you. I hated everything you stood for. But part of me also hated that I'd started to believe in you right before it all fell apart. I thought I'd been a fool. You weren't, he said firmly. I was, and you had every right to hate me. She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk. I don't hate you anymore. The words hit him like sunlight breaking through a storm. You don't? She shook her head. No, I'm still angry sometimes. But not hate. I don't think that ever lasts. Not when there was something real underneath it all. Ethan's breath caught. There was, for me at least. I know, she said quietly. I just didn't want to admit it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things they both understood, but didn't need to say. After a moment, Clara stood. I should go. I just wanted to see for myself. Ethan rose as well, his instinct urging him to stop her, but he didn't. He knew that forcing her to stay would only undo what little peace they had found. Instead, he said, Will you at least visit the new center? It's opening next week. She hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. Thank you, he said simply. She paused at the door, then turned to face him once more. Ethan, you've done good work. Don't stop now. I won't, he promised. When she left, the room felt different, not empty, but lighter. He knew she hadn't forgiven him completely. Not yet, but forgiveness, he realized, was not a single act. It was a process, like healing, and she had just taken the first step. The following week, the Harlem Center opened to a crowd of families, volunteers, and city officials. The building stood as a bright contrast to its surroundings, its walls painted with murals designed by local artists. There were classrooms, workshops, and a small library, all built according to Clara's original plan. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the children run through the doors. Then he saw her. Clara stood near the entrance, speaking with one of the volunteers. When their eyes met, she smiled. Not the cautious, distant smile she had given him before, but something genuine, something new. He walked over slowly. You came, he said. I said maybe, she replied. Maybe turned into yes. Do you like it? It's perfect, she said softly. Exactly what it was supposed to be. They stood side by side, watching as a group of children began painting another mural on the back wall. The air was filled with laughter, the kind that made the world feel simple again. Clara, he said after a while, I don't know if I'll ever deserve another chance with you, but I'll spend the rest of my life earning the right to try. She looked at him, her eyes warm but steady. You don't have to prove anything, Ethan. Not to me. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's enough. He nodded, understanding. Some part of him had hoped for more, a reconciliation, a promise. But he realized now that this was better. What they had was fragile and real, built not on illusion but on truth. As the afternoon light softened, casting long shadows over the courtyard, Clara turned to him and said quietly, People can change. You proved that. He smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. You're the reason I did. They stood together in silence, the noise of the city fading into the distance. Around them, life went on, children laughing, volunteers calling out instructions, the hum of new beginnings. For Ethan Wallace, the man who had once believed he could buy the world, the moment was simple and profound. Redemption, he understood now, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about living differently in its shadow, about choosing, every day, to be better than the man you once were. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan realized that, for the first time, he wasn't chasing victory. He was finally at peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next powerful story. Watch our next video for more emotional twists and unforgettable lessons, and share this story with your friends. Someone out there needs to hear it today.